In 2008, Mark Beaumont, a 22-year-old Scot, broke the world record for cycling 18,000 miles round the world, doing it in just under 6 months. I avidly read about his achievement and thought that it just looked like so much fun. The physical challenge, the places you cycled through, the people you met. No way could I imagine doing it, as he was cycling between 100 and 200 miles a day, more than I could cope with. Just a minute, I said to myself. I wouldn't have to try and break any records. I could do it at my own pace. I reckon I could manage 50 to 60 miles a day and get round in a year or so. The idea was born. I'd always been pretty sporty, but this was a challenge of a completely different order, especially for someone my age. Christine suggested that I tried cycling Land's End to John O'Groats, just under 1,000 miles, as a trial, which is what I successfully did. As it rained 10 of the 14 days, this confirmed my thinking that I would try and have a decent bed and roof over my head each night, rather than camp. This would also help to keep the luggage weight on the bike down. I had to wait until I retired before I was able to set off, but there were a few hurdles along the way. First of all, I had developed osteoarthritic hips, such that I had to give up impact sports, hence the interest in cycling that my body could still cope with. The right hip deteriorated to such an extent that I needed a total hip replacement. Then, out of the blue, my wonderful mother was diagnosed with stomach cancer. I immediately decided that I wouldn't take off on the trip whilst my parents were still alive. Sadly, my mother died 6 months later, followed by my father 3 months after that. A few weeks before retirement, I was cycling home from work through Beeston when I was rammed from behind by a car. My right shoulder hit the road, causing multiple fractures of my scapula. My right leg, the one with the hip replacement, also suffered. The trip had to be put off again while I recovered. I took the decision to jump across high-risk areas where there was no safe route to cycle. So I planned to fly from Istanbul in Turkey to Delhi in India, rather than cycle through Syria, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Also to take a train across the Nullarbor Plain, a desert in Australia where there's nothing for hundreds and hundreds of miles. No accommodation, no food, no water. I wanted to maximise the probability of me returning in one piece. An adventure such as this would require careful planning. All equipment needed to be robust, high performance, lightweight and clothes fast drying. I chose a Koga World Traveller bike, not with derailleur but pinion gears, a sealed gearbox sitting in the bottom bracket of the bike frame that would carry on working efficiently even when covered in mud and sand. It just needed an oil change every 5,000 miles. I then had the bike optimally set up using the latest 3D motion technology to reduce the likelihood of injury due to long days in the saddle. When they heard of my plans, friends and colleagues said that I must raise money for charity. I then chose Cancer Research UK in memory of my mother and Tradecraft Exchange, which carries out development work in the poorer countries of the world. Both of these charities focus not on temporary sticking plaster solutions, but permanent ones. Tradecraft was about to celebrate its 40th anniversary, and I had been one of the original fair traders. Medicines and vaccinations had to be sorted. Training plus physio dealing with the after effects of the accident had to be fitted in. Then it was meeting up with people to say farewell before I left. And finally, the last meal out with Christine.
But I simply can't imagine where you start when you're planning to go around the world. Is it literally a blank sheet of paper and an atlas? Where do you start?
Essentially, yes. You've got to do over 18,000 miles, but there's no fixed route. That's down to you to decide. So my starting point was to get a map of the world on my computer at home, on my PC, and to colour code every country red, amber, yellow, green in terms of risk profile to choose the safest route around the world that would cover the 18,000 miles. And I also told my family that I'd jump over hotspots like the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Syria, rather than ploughing on through there.
And actually navigating it, presumably there are main routes through all the countries. How do you deal with the sort of byways and the highways and just knowing locally where you're supposed to be going?
Technology. I relied on GPS. Firstly, my Garmin GPS that sat on the handlebars of the bike. That in some countries would navigate for me and show me an actual route. And the other mapping aid was Google Maps, which I had on my iPhone and iPad. And I would overnight look at the best route for the next day. In some countries, Google Maps would come up with cycling routes. In other countries, you just had to use Google Maps for motor cars, which then would provide the odd problem on the road when I'd be cycling along and then come to a section of road where bicycles weren't allowed, and I then had to work a route around that. Sometimes that was straightforward and sometimes that was a bit of a problem, especially where the road that cyclists weren't allowed on was a large bridge and there wasn't another road over that river for tens of miles in either direction.
How did you manage in countries like Japan and China where you can't read the signs, you can't read the road signs?
That was what I call quite fun, and you rely even more on your GPS devices. You just don't get the additional confirmation as to where you are and that you're going in the right direction that you do when you can read the road signs. One further challenge was in China, where the accuracy of the Western GPS was not as accurate as in other countries. I suspect because of some kind of jamming from the Chinese. After a wonderful send-off from Bramcote Hills Park, the logistics of getting from Nottingham to Agadir in Morocco worked like clockwork. Dave drove me to Manchester Airport. The flights were on time, the luggage, including the bike, transferred to the connecting flight, and just after midnight, I arrived at my first hotel in Agadir. The following morning, I opened up the cardboard box and put the bike back together again. After a good buffet breakfast, I was on my way. The start in Morocco was jumping in the deep end, but it provided a special experience that starting in Europe would not have had. For example, I got a buzz setting off for the day, encountering shepherds in remote villages taking their flocks of goats out. When I set out, my legs weren't in the best of condition. Neither was I as fit as I would have liked. After the car accident, when I started training again, I ramped up too quickly and had serious problems with my left soleus muscle in my calf. I was unable to cycle properly for the couple of months before I left. Initially, in Morocco, I was only cycling half the daily miles that I had planned. Gradually, over the first few months, that built up, although there was one occasion where I couldn't make my destination and had to take a local bus going back the next day to restart where I'd finished cycling. There are different forms of communication. One very helpful man, with whom I shared no common language, using a stone, drew me a map in the soil at the side of the road opposite his house to show me where I needed to go. In Portugal and northern Spain, I cycled the Camino, the ancient pilgrimage route to and from Santiago de Compostela. As well as meeting many Christians from all around the world en route, the pilgrim service in St James's Cathedral was very special. Cycling along the Loire, the Rhine and Danube was both beautiful and flat, with many majestic cathedrals along the way. But there are also much smaller gems, such as the 10,000-year-old Lion Man in Ulm, sculpted with flint by early man from a mammoth tusk, only 11 inches high, stunning. And the Gallery of Bruegels in Vienna, paintings so full of life and remarkably painted 500 years ago. Whilst in Geneva, I was able to visit my mother's identical twin sister Anne in her care home. This produced mixed emotions. As children, we found it difficult to distinguish between them. Whilst cycling through the beautiful Austrian countryside, I was abruptly taken to another world. A couple of hours spent looking around the Mauthausen concentration camp and I was left numb, especially when in the gas chamber itself, a chilling reminder of man's darker side. Cycling down the coast towards Greece through Croatia, Montenegro and Albania, I was joined for a week by my good friend from university and best man, Byron. After so many miles alone, it was good to be travelling with someone, especially to chat with at mealtimes. I also cycled occasionally with a few fellow cyclists that I met on the road, such as David from Germany, David and Iris from Belgium, plus Mohammed, who was cycling to Mecca. The apartment that we stayed in Šibenik was in a 16th century house right next to the cathedral. Unfortunately, after our host had left, the door handle fell off and the lock failed, leaving us locked inside the apartment. Our loud shouts and banging on the door eventually brought her back and we were released. I often came across interesting things away from the main sites. An ancient, peaceful market square to rest in. In Corinth, I found a column to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, St Paul's great chapter on love. I found this very poignant, as it was the reading at my mother's funeral. I lost 3 weeks due to bike breakdowns in Porto and Thessaloniki. I was fortunate that these were interesting major cities. However, it did require cycling for 2 days with the bike stuck in one gear to reach Thessaloniki. It strikes me as ironic that these 2 significant delays were both due to expensive German engineering that I had chosen for its ultra reliability. Some people thought beforehand that the trip might teach me patience, but I'm not sure that happened. The mountains took their cumulative toll. I crossed both the Pyrenees from Spain to France and the Jura from France to Switzerland in 2 days, and that was okay. I had 5 days riding the Greek Pindus Mountains. Each day I was offered a number of lifts by kind motorists and lorry drivers, which I politely declined. However, after climbing steeply for all of one morning, a helpful farmer was adamant that he was giving me a lift. He wouldn't take no for an answer, and I succumbed. As we sped up the mountains, I did not feel regret. He deposited me some 10 miles further on. There was still plenty of cycling ahead, but the worst of the day's climb was now behind me. Also in the Pindus Mountains, I came close to having to sleep outside in a field with wild animals roaming around. Finding accommodation in the right place in remote areas is difficult. When I arrived at my pre-booked apartment, I was told dismissively by the owner that he had let it to someone else, and that was that. With the light fading and no accommodation for miles around, I eventually managed to find somewhere to stay, much to my relief. 15 miles away, having asked for help from everyone that I came across. It was a joy visiting the ruins and museums of the classical cities of Mycenae, Athens, Delphi, Vergina, Troy and Istanbul. The figures of Agamemnon, Achilles, Helen and Alexander the Great came alive. The sheer variety of beauty, culture, people and history was fascinating and wonderful. It brought home to me how the movement of people, sometimes as a result of conflict, cross-fertilisation of ideas, trade with faraway places and restless spirit of discovery are not recent phenomena but have always happened. Milestones were important to me. My daily spreadsheet, using data from the Garmin GPS, tracked both my progress and performance. Significant points were completing my first country, Morocco, and the first 1,000 miles reached in Vila Verde, Portugal. Reaching 5,000 miles, which I did in Preveza, Greece, felt a tremendous achievement and a real high. I had made it over 6,000 miles across Africa and Europe, a third of the way around the world. It had been tough, but this was on fairly familiar territory. India was going to be providing a much bigger challenge.
I'm very curious to know how you sorted your accommodation every day, because obviously you could book nothing in advance at all. What did you do each day to ensure you had a bed for the following night?
Well, the first thing to say is that I always tried to book accommodation up ahead, because I didn't want to arrive somewhere and then find there was nowhere or it was all booked up. I used my iPad, Booking.com, Airbnb, Expedia for booking things online. That wasn't always possible. So some countries like Laos, there wasn't much online and you just had to take the risk, turn up somewhere and hope that you could get in. When I started doing that, I was rather apprehensive, cycling each day, just hoping I could find somewhere, but it worked out and you got used to that.
Did you stay anywhere really awful?
Not really awful. I did meet people who were staying in some low-down dives, and thought, "Oh, I'm glad I'm not staying there." But the places I stayed, whether they were decent hotels or hostels, were all pretty decent. Some of the cheaper places in India, you had rather more insects and that to deal with than in the slightly more expensive places.
What about food? Were you able to find a decent meal each night? And how did you cope with the rigours of eating something different all the time in a different country and not getting ill?
The food being different in lots of different countries, that was part of the attraction of the adventure. What was available each night varied, all depending where I was. In major cities, the problem was deciding from the hordes of restaurants which one I was going to eat in. Other places, the question was, would there be somewhere to eat at all? There were quite a number of places I stayed where there was just one place to eat, and whatever they were offering, that was what you had to have, or go without.
And when you arrived somewhere, some little, inn or hotel somewhere, were they curious about you? Did they regard you as some kind of eccentric or celebrity, or how did they treat you?
Well, I think like most of the people back here, they were both impressed with my challenge, but also thought I was a bit mad. Lots of places, when they heard what I was doing, they wanted to have photos taken with me. They thought that was great, and posted the photos to their friends, and they started following me on Facebook. So I'm still being followed by hundreds and hundreds of people from all around the world, which was absolutely fantastic.
Tell me the most luxurious, when you felt really like a prince staying somewhere.
The most luxurious, without doubt, those were the ones that I booked when Christine came out to stay, because I had to book somewhere a little more attractive than some of the places that I normally stayed in. Nothing quite prepares you for India, even if you've been there before. The noise, the smell, the frenzy. It's a land of extremes. Extreme wealth alongside extreme poverty. Amazing beauty alongside squalor. Cutting edge IT alongside human and animal muscle power. Colourful, noisy, in your face, always alive. India started with the golden triangle of Imperial Delhi, Agra and the Taj Mahal, together with Jaipur. Then west across the desert state of Rajasthan with its forts and palaces. The imposing mountain forts some never captured. Kumbhalgarh with defensive walls so wide mounted soldiers 8 abreast could ride along them. And Chittagong, 7 miles long. Opulent palaces displaying the fantastic wealth of the Maharajas. On 2 occasions, I managed to cycle over 5,000 miles without a single puncture. However, there were also not so good times, such as the single day descending from Kumbhalgarh that I had to repair 6 punctures, often with an audience. Also the time when, whilst mending a puncture in a rural area, I discovered that the tyre itself had split and the inner tube protruded out through the gap. I patched up the tyre from the inside with Gorilla Tape, and amazingly this saw me through 600 miles until I could get new tyres. To avoid the hard slog of the middle of India, I took a 3-day train journey and continued cycling in the beautiful, lush coastal state of Kerala. The contrast with the desert state of Rajasthan couldn't really be greater. Health-wise, I was very fortunate and experienced no serious illnesses. Not surprisingly, I had a few cases of Delhi belly. In Rajasthan, the desert state, I developed a chest infection as a result of cycling along very dusty roads and the high levels of pollution. This stopped me for nearly a week whilst I recovered. On my first day in Kerala, having cycled 60 miles, I fainted on arrival at my hotel. This was due to dehydration as a result of the heat and humidity. I've been drinking more than in northern India, but clearly not more enough. Drinking a few bottles of water soon sorted me out. The weather has a major impact, not only on the enjoyment of a day's cycling, but also as to whether it's possible at all. I experienced a cyclone in Kerala, a hurricane and an earthquake in Greece, as well as countless storms. Headwinds were a frequent problem, with my speed being halved or even worse as a result. On days with cyclones, I did consider whether I should cycle at all or turn back. I had hotels identified which I could head for shelter if conditions became too bad, but in remoter areas even this wasn't possible. Resting in bus shelters, the whole shelter sounded and felt as though it would be blown away at any moment. In France and India, I also encountered floods, which forced the taking of alternative longer routes to my destination. In one tiny village, I stopped to have a look at a very small church by the side of the road. On entering it, I discovered a small group of people cleaning up after the church had been flooded by the cyclone. Although we had no common language, they showed me a gaping hole in the roof. They were both surprised and delighted when I gave them a donation to help fix the roof before cycling on. The Hindu temples of Tamil Nadu are something else. Monumental, thousands of years old, many with intricate carvings and sculptures, some brightly coloured and some retaining their natural stone colour, some peaceful and others a riot of noise. Full of pilgrims, religion at its most elemental. There was a great variety of roads and tracks to cycle on. Many excellent surfaces, often with cycle lanes or wide hard shoulders. However, there are also many miles on rough surfaces, dirt tracks and even grass. Part of the adventure was experiencing an enormous variety of food. Sometimes I didn't know what I had ordered, and sometimes I didn't know what the food was even whilst I was eating it. In one hotel, I was worried that I would not have enough to eat at breakfast, as the portions were rather small. The waiter could not speak English, nor me Hindu. I was being offered, so I thought, a choice from 3 or 4 dishes. I requested everything and felt I'd got that across. 3 sizable dishes duly arrived, which I finished, and was just about to leave when 2 more appeared. Before I'd finished these, 3 more large dishes arrived, and I thought, oh no, I hope there aren't any more. Fortunately there weren't. On another occasion I was told off for using cutlery and given a lesson on how to eat properly with my fingers. I had not only survived India but was approaching halfway. Despite the weather conditions, a few minor health problems and the state of the roads, I had had a fantastic couple of months with the Indian people, culture, scenery and history. Southeast Asia now awaited.
Robert, what really fascinates me about your trip is that for 18 months you carried your whole life in 2 panniers on your bike. So tell me, how did you choose what you're going to put into there?
Well, I had to be very disciplined and decide just what were the absolutely essential things that you need for that. The first and most important decision was to decide not to camp, so I didn't have to take a tent and camping equipment, and that helped to keep the weight down on the bike, which was very important, especially going up hills.
Yes.
Then the other equipment, it needed to be lightweight, high performance, so I took 2 lots of cycling kit, shirts, shorts, undershorts, padded undershorts, cagoule, Gore-Tex cagoule over trousers, a couple of pairs of clothing for casual use when I wasn't cycling, first aid kit, and then I was into the technology which helped me to keep weight down. So I used a Garmin for navigation, iPad, iPhone, and it was surprising how little you really need, or I needed, to survive for a year. I had to wash clothes every night, and of course they'd been chosen to be quick drying.
Was there anything you really would have liked to have taken that you couldn't squeeze in?
I think the one thing that I would have liked to have taken would have been an SLR camera. I took all my photos on an iPhone and I was staggered by the quality of those for something so small. I decided not to take an SLR, both because of its weight and with moving parts. It would have been likely to have gone wrong, bouncing around on the back of the bike for 18 months. But I would have liked to have had something of the quality of an SLR.
And you presumably couldn't add anything. You didn't bring anything back, you didn't buy anything, you didn't add to the weight in any way at all?
Well, I could buy things on the way round. So, for example, when the Garmin GPS broke in Australia, I had to buy a new one. Christine, my wife, came out to see me every so often, and she was able to bring me things out. So she brought replacement clothes when I'd worn things out, and when I needed new sizes of clothes as I slimmed down from the cycling. And she also brought out replacement and spare parts for the bike, like new tyres and inner tubes.
And this very minimal way of living that you adopted, I mean, since you've come back, has that altered the way you live now?
I wouldn't say it's altered the way I live, but it has made me grateful for the things we normally have around us here. And I do think back and think of the simplicity of life when I was on the road compared with life back home. First was a Christmas break in Bangkok with Christine and Betsy. This was a special time after so many months of video calls, messages and emails. We were immediately made to feel at home by the members of Christchurch, the Anglican Church in Bangkok. The Christmas services were a mixture of the familiar and the new, with the congregation being an almost equal mix of Western and Asian. Time for relaxing, sightseeing and allowing muscle recovery. Also some rather different experiences, such as a course on Thai cooking. Visiting so many countries, it was vital to keep track of visa requirements and ensure that I wasn't in any country longer than I was allowed to be. Cycling through some countries, such as Vietnam, was tight, so that any delay would have caused serious problems. The most difficult country to get a visa for was China. They don't particularly like unattached cyclists and require extensive information, and you don't mention cycling. My application ran to 50 pages of A4, but the visa came through without challenge. The temples of Thailand, Cambodia and Laos were totally different from those of India. Smaller, calmer, more peaceful and individual. The temples of Angkor Wat were magnificent, but not quite as good, I felt, as the hype, being number one on many people's global bucket list, had led me to believe. Perhaps it's just management of expectations. The memorial of skeletons in Siem Reap to the victims of the Khmer Rouge, after 25% of the population had been killed, was sobering, much as the Mauthausen concentration camp had been earlier. I came across Pol Pot's grave close to a remote mountain border post. No tourists around here. Vietnam had stunning karst rock scenery, thought-provoking modern history of the American War, and wonderful food. In Laos, 9,000 miles was reached. 9,000 miles! Halfway round the world. Sometimes I can't believe that the last 9 months has actually happened. Now it was cycling back home. Other round-the-world cyclists that I encountered on the road had suffered incidents such as being robbed of money and credit cards at knife point, attacked by bears, attacked by wild boar, and bikes being stolen. Although I had faced many risks, the worst I experienced involved a gang of teenage boys on motorbikes in Vietnam who, as they passed me, slapped and hit me. Thinking they had disappeared into the distance, I was surprised when this happened again. They had waited down a side street for me to pass. This was repeated 3 times. One of the lads even removed one of his trainers to hit me with. I was fine and no damage was done, but it was unpleasant. China was brilliant, totally different to anywhere else that I'd been. It was also more stressful than anywhere else as well, because everything was different and the consequences of anything going wrong much greater, especially with an authoritarian government, and harder to resolve. I had been very apprehensive before entering and relieved on exit, but despite all that, the culture, history, people and experience was brilliant. Definitely a country not to be missed. I went to visit Chikan, a picturesque historic town of 50,000 people. As I approached, it became difficult as many roads were closed off and there was lots of demolition work going on. Eventually, I managed to locate it, but was prevented from going any further by security men. I finally discovered a way in and found myself cycling around a ghost town. Very surreal. The whole population had been moved out so that the town could be renovated and restored. A particular highlight was visiting the 2,000-year-old tomb of Emperor Cao Mo in Guangzhou and seeing his jade burial suit stitched together with red silk. Stunning. Communication was an aspect of the trip that was both challenging but entertaining. My English, French and German saw me across Morocco and most of Europe. Fortunately, English is one of the 22 national languages of India. Southeast Asia and China are a challenge of a different order. Not only the spoken language, but the written letters and characters are completely different. Without Google Translate, I don't know how I would have coped.
请问食品店在哪里?
Although this was not always totally accurate, such as when I tried to buy some gloves to keep my hands warm while cycling in China. The closest I got was being shown rubber washing up gloves. Again, without modern technology, communication back home to family and friends would have been difficult and infrequent. As it was, video calls, Facebook, email and text kept me connected every day. I was now well over halfway and had completed the most exotic part of the trip, what on paper was the riskiest. Ahead lay Australia, Japan and the USA. Modern countries and English spoken in the two larger ones. Everything was going well. What could possibly go wrong? But before Australia, I had one extra trip to make. Christine and my first grandson, born to James and Laura. So I had a quick trip back to England to see the family and greet Seth, my new grandson.
You travelled in 29 countries altogether, and every country has a different currency. So how did you deal with that? Did you have to get money out every time you went into a new country?
Money was something you have to track very carefully. Not quite every country has a different currency, because going across Europe, most of the countries use the euro, so that made it very easy. Then I took quite a number of credit cards, Visa, MasterCard, credit debit cards, and used those to get money out of ATMs. Christine brought me local currency when she came out to visit me. I also used electronic payment formats, PayPal and Apple Pay, and I always like to have at least a couple of weeks of hard currency with me, so if all the other money formats failed, then I'd at least be able to keep going for a while without being stopped, and also give myself time to deal with the normal money problem.
How safe was to go to a moneylender?
The moneylenders were safe, but you just didn't get a very good rate of exchange. The weirdest one was in China, where the moneylender had a table at the back of a food shop and pulled out a great big bag stuffed full of currency, and just counted it out, and that was it. not exactly terribly professional or auditable, but that's the way they work there.
Were you ever afraid of being robbed, or if your bank cards had been stolen, what would you have done then?
That would have been a very big problem, and one of the probably biggest risks on the ride. I did take a couple of old expired credit cards with me, with the idea that if I was mugged, I would hand them over and hope that would deal with it.
Which was the country where you had to have the most notes? You know, some of these currencies have a really massive ratio.
I think that would have been Laos, where you were taking millions of the currency out of the ATM. And that also actually made it quite... You had to be very careful when buying things, because converting the currency mentally in your brain whilst you were buying something to make sure you were handing over the right number of notes, that made it a bit tricky.
Was there anywhere at all where you couldn't use a credit card or a debit card?
Well, in Cambodia, one of the ATMs swallowed one of my credit cards, and I had to go back to the bank the next day, and eventually they gave it back to me. In China, there was a problem that 95% of the ATMs didn't accept Visa or MasterCard, and you had to work really hard to find one that did.
Australia was a fascinating mixture of both the very familiar, the language, British-style buildings and institutions, but also the very different, the animals, landscape, weather and Indigenous people's culture. Western Australia consisted of Perth, followed by beautiful coastal roads, vineyards, vast forests and bush. It rapidly became obvious that not only was Australia a vast country, but the daily distances that I had to cycle to reach the next supplies and accommodation were very large. I was now having to cycle up to 100 miles a day, and the cumulative effect took its toll, especially on my left leg. Enforced rest days, daily massages, kinesiology tape, knee braces, plus more frequent and longer rests during the cycling day, all helped to keep me going. Just. The longest day, both in terms of time in the saddle and distance, was exhausting. 9.5 hours and 96 miles. I had set out to take a shortcut through the forest, but the track became tougher and rougher, slower and slower. I decided to turn back to the road. The road itself was isolated through the bush and forest. Nothing for 75 miles. And a passing car about every half hour. I even followed a kangaroo down the road. I also battled headwind. Oh, and 3/4 of a mile climb. For the first time, I did not finish riding until after sunset. Cycling through the pitch black of the forest in the chill of the evening, illuminated by my LED lights for the final stretch, was dramatic. Shortly after setting off one morning, the left pedal sheared off. Although I passed through a few small villages, none of these had bike shops, so I had to cycle 50 miles with one pedal to reach a bike shop where I could get new pedals fitted. Both legs were aching that night due to the unorthodox cycling technique. The Nullarbor Plain is 700 miles of barren limestone between Western and South Australia. as there is no water, food or accommodation for hundreds and hundreds of miles at a stretch, I decided to cross this by train on the Indian Pacific. This was a delightfully relaxing 2 days, resting, good food, watching the scenery and chatting to the other travellers. After my time in Asia, it became much easier to communicate. There were also many random acts of kindness, such as when I was eating my lunch in a park in Millicent, and a lady came up to me, wished me Happy Easter, and then gave me a bottle of cold water. She returned a quarter of an hour later with a small fruit cake. Delicious. South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales encompassed Adelaide, Melbourne, Canberra and Sydney, plus the Great Coast Road. I was welcomed in many places, not least by the Uniting Church on Easter morning, the Dean of Melbourne and the British Ambassador in Canberra. Reaching Sydney, I had made it across Australia, a vast, beautiful continent, interspersed with engaging cities and a warm, open people. But it had been a hard, long slog, and my legs were certainly feeling the effect of it.
You come on, sing Matilda with me. Daddy's ghost may be heard as he passed by that billabong. You come on, sing Matilda with me.
I know modern technology is featured vastly in this trip, and even perhaps 10 years ago it wouldn't have been the same. You wouldn't have had access to quite so many things. Tell me what was on your iPad, because I know you carried a massive amount of information and resources on that.
Yeah, the iPad and iPhone as well, they were invaluable, and I shudder to think what it would have been like doing a trip like this 10, 20 years ago. The iPad, I had an enormous amount on. I had, for example, Lonely Planet travel guides for all 29 countries that I travelled around on. I had reading books, although I didn't actually end up having much time to read them. I had iTunes with my whole music library from home, so I'd be playing music in the morning and the evening. I had the various apps for booking accommodation. I took all my photos with the iPhone, and those transferred to the iPad. I ended up with 50,000 photos that I took during the course of the trip. The GoPro camera that I used for taking videos on the bike, those videos uploaded to the iPad as well, and I had about 300 of those. Then there was Facebook for communication, keeping in touch with people, keeping them updated as to what I've been doing each day. And then the video calling to family and friends back home, as well as other apps for sort of Google Maps and navigation. Then when it came to taking flights and travelling, the airline apps for sort of booking and sort of getting information about boarding planes and so on. I mean, modern technology just allows you to do so much, and there's just so much that you can do with iPads and iPhones. It's absolutely tremendous.
Were you terrified of losing it? I mean, had you lost your iPad or had it been stolen? You know, did you worry about that at all?
Yes. I'm not just worried about it being stolen, worried about it going wrong, about it failing. So I had an iPad, well, but for both the iPad and the iPhone, protective cases, rubber cases. So if I drop them onto concrete, they bounce rather than dying. the iPad and the iPhone also acted as backup to each other. So if one had packed up, I'd have been able to carry on with most of the functions on the other device. But yes, if something had gone wrong, certainly with both of them, it would have been, you know, a total disaster.
Did you pack it away in a particular place each day? In fact, in your panniers, did you have a special place for different things?
Everything had its particular place, both because I felt that was the right place for that particular item, whether it was at the bottom of the pannier or at the top, because it was more protected in a certain place, or it was easier to get to in a certain place. And then other items were in the handlebar bag on the bike, so I could access it as I was cycling along. So the iPhone, the GoPro needed to be in there.
I had planned to cycle Japan after Australia and then finish in the USA. However, an American lecturer that I met advised that it would be too hot for me to cycle in Southern California and New Mexico when I was planning to. So I flew from Sydney to Los Angeles. Now I was travelling along the historical and quirky Route 66 from Los Angeles to Chicago. This included major and fascinating cities such as Los Angeles, Santa Fe, Oklahoma City, St. Louis, Springfield, Illinois, and Chicago, with vast tracts in between, including mountains, deserts, dirt roads, and Native American reservations. Emphasis changed state by state, from Spanish in the southwestern states to pride in the opening up of the American hinterland in the Midwestern states, and then the American Civil War with the split between the northern and southern states due to slavery in Illinois, home of Abraham Lincoln. Instead of cycling straight across the middle of the Mojave Desert, where there was nowhere to stay or obtain supplies for several days, I decided to take a much longer route around the edges, where I could find places to stay and eat each night. I normally set out each morning with 11 pints of water on the bike. Now I was carrying 20. Even so, I felt highly vulnerable each day as I crossed the mountains and looked out across vast expanses of sand. Everything was fine so long as nothing went wrong. For me, the best week in the US was that in Arizona. Here I saw the Grand Canyon, that was one sight that definitely did not disappoint, followed a few days later by the meteor crater formed 50,000 years ago by meteor impact, nearly a mile in diameter and over 1/10 of a mile deep, where Apollo astronauts used to train before their lunar flights. And then a few more days later, the petrified forest, the fossilised remains of a forest from 35 million years ago. Despite the beauty of the scenery, this region was very tough going. The highest altitude reached on my trip at 7,500 feet, combined with intense winds. In addition to the climbs, the effect of the thinner air could be felt. The police were generally very helpful. I had thought I was in trouble in Portugal when I was stopped cycling along the hard shoulder of a main road out of Lisbon in the rush hour. However, the 4 policemen thought it would be safer for everyone concerned, both me and the drivers, if I was cycling somewhere else. So they put the bike and me in the back of their van and gave me a lift to a safer road. Nothing, however, could beat the Chicago police, where I was invited to a family party, having had a chat with a couple of them at the roadside one morning. Whilst wheeling the bike into my motel room in Detroit, I noticed a crack at the top of the frame. The seat tube had cracked right the way through. Disaster! Was that it? Could it be repaired? Would I need a completely new bike? After some frantic phone calls to Dave at Cycle Sense in Tadcaster, from whom I had bought the bike, I was advised to patch it up and try carrying on. I used a few cable ties with Gorilla Tape. A local bike shop drilled a couple of holes for bolts to help support my weight. Considering the country's roads and traffic that I had cycled through, I was fortunate not to have had any serious accidents. The one in Nottingham before I left was more than enough. The worst that I actually experienced was minor, my fault and the result of tiredness. After a large late breakfast, I set off at noon from Chicago for a short day's cycling. Rather than stopping for a rest and something to eat, I decided to press on to the motel in a single ride. However, my blood sugar levels were dropping and my concentration was going. I was cycling along the hard shoulder of a main road when the hard shoulder started to narrow dramatically to about a foot wide. Suddenly, I found that my front wheel had slipped off the tarmac, and then I and the bike were sliding horizontally down the road before bouncing to a halt. Luggage was scattered across the road, knees and elbows grazed. Fortunately, there were no other vehicles around and the bike was okay. I shook myself down and carried on. Christine and I had been married on the 21st of July 1979 in Bristol. It was therefore wonderful when she was able to come out and join me again for a couple of weeks, driving along Route 66 herself whilst I cycled each day. We were thus able to celebrate our 40th wedding anniversary in Chicago at the Palmer House Hilton, rather posher than my usual stays. Having worked for Boots the Chemists for over 40 years, it was a pleasure to visit the Walgreens Boots Alliance headquarters in Deerfield, on the outskirts of Chicago. Canada was more relaxed than the USA, and it was a particular delight being hosted by Mark and Elaine, with whom I'd worked for decades at Boots. Two highlights were the Niagara Falls, although that was on a stormy and misty day, and visiting Uncle Tom's Cabin, home of Josiah Henson, the freed slave on whom Harriet Beecher Stowe based her novel, which became one of the triggers for the American Civil War. So I'd made it along Route 66, across the USA. I was nearly there at 18,000 miles. Japan, my final country, would provide a fascinating culture with which to finish. However, as I cycled along each day, I realised that the whole bike frame could collapse underneath me at any moment. My left leg was in a similar state, kept going by a knee brace, ice, physio, massage and occasional rest. Would the bike and my body hold up for the last few miles in Japan?
I'd like to ask you about your mental state when you were doing all this. Did you wake up every morning feeling motivated and keen to get going, or were there days when you thought, oh, this really wasn't a very good idea? I mean, how did you motivate yourself and keep yourself motivated?
I didn't have to keep myself motivated because I was just having such a fantastic time. All the places I was visiting, people I was meeting, the things I was seeing, it was just great. So I'd get up in the morning and I had a set routine for getting out by 8:30, 9 o'clock to be on the road, getting some miles underneath my belt. It was just a case of getting on with it and enjoying it. But I suppose there were days, especially when I was picking up the injuries, the overuse injuries, when my body was basically saying, come on, overuse injuries, I need a bit of rest, but I still pushed on. I suppose those were the times when it was a case of forcing myself to keep going, but you just carry on to the end of the day. You just do what's in front of you.
Did you find resources in you that you didn't know you had?
I don't think I found resources that my family didn't know that I had, because they always realised that I was extremely determined. But I was surprised at how determined I was, and how I would just keep on going until the target had been reached. But most of the time that just seemed normal to me.
Were there times of loneliness? I mean, you're on your own for most of 18 months. I know Christine came out and you met people, but basically you're on your own. Did you cope with that all the time?
I never felt lonely because there was just so much going on, so much to do, so many people to meet, places to visit, things to see, miles to cover, and also with modern technology, Facebook, emails, texts, video messaging. I was talking to Christine and the family virtually every evening. I also knew that I was being prayed for by lots of people back home, by churches in Nottingham, and that was a great support to me. So I never felt lonely, no.
I had been expecting the last 1,000 miles up Japan to be an interesting and gentle finale. It was certainly interesting, with Japanese history and culture being totally different to that of any of the other countries that I had visited, but gentle, definitely not. The combination of concern that the bike would not make it, my body being extremely tired and really needing some rest, especially my left knee, and the weather, a couple of typhoons, Krosa and Faxai, thunderstorms, humidity, temperature and climb, meant that the last leg with the finish line tangible was a struggle. Japan was absolutely fascinating. The hotel rooms and food portions were very small, but the temples, palaces and museums were stunning. I cycled the beautiful Shimanami Kaido cycle route, which hops from island to island up the Seto Sea via some amazing modern suspension bridges and a couple of ferries. Visiting Hiroshima was another gut-wrenching day, especially seeing a mangled bicycle in the museum. A day that raised many questions, but no easy answers. A trip like this creates multiple connections. Thus in Hiroshima, I recollected visiting Ulm in Germany, where Einstein was born, and also passing close by Los Alamos in New Mexico, home of the Manhattan Project which developed the atom bomb. Similarly, I had visited multiple locations connected with Vasco da Gama, the 16th century Portuguese explorer, his original tomb in Kochi, forts that he had built on the east coast of southern India, a square named after him in Macau, and his final resting place in Lisbon. This is Robert, about to start, hopefully, the day that I break the 18,000 mile mark. I'm just about ready. I've had breakfast. I've got my padded undershorts on, chamois cream, suntan lotion, good to go. I'm just about to check out from the hotel and then I'll be on my way. Sitting out in the morning, there was more than the normal sense of excitement and anticipation. A day I will never forget. The day that I reached the 18,000 mile mark, which I did at Osaka Castle. Here, I'm in Osaka, Japan, and I've just made the 18,000 miles. After 17 months of cycling and 10 years of planning and waiting to start, I have joined the select group of round the world cyclists. I now just needed to cover the last few hundred miles to Tokyo. Having reached 18,000 miles, if the bike collapsed underneath me, I could just hop on a train to get there. The bike held up, but whilst cycling up Mount Fuji, my body had other ideas. The cumulative punishment had taken its toll. Explaining my situation using Google Translate, a friendly policeman ordered me a taxi. But Mount Fuji itself was another wow moment. The next day, without incident, I reached Tokyo and started a 3-week holiday with Christine and Betsy, who had flown out. A bit of time for rest and recovery before my official return back in Nottingham on the 19th of October 2019. As a bonus, the Rugby World Cup was just kicking off in Japan.
Christine, this must have been as hard an undertaking for you as it was for Robert. So I want to ask you first of all, how hard was it to let him go?
It wasn't very hard because I knew that it was something that he absolutely had to do. There was no question about it.
Mm-hmm. Were there particular times when you were more anxious about him than at other times?
I was anxious about him when he was in China because I didn't know before he went into China whether or not I was going to be able to get in contact with him. When I got the first email, then I was greatly relieved.
Mm-hmm. Did it feel like a very long 18 months? I know you went out a few times in that time, but it's a long time, 18 months.
Yes, it did feel a very long time. I think once he'd reached the halfway stage, I was counting down, and that made a big difference.
Are you both changed by this? I mean, I can see that for Robert it must change him in some way, because you can't do that big an adventure and for it not to do that. What about you? Are you changed by the experience yourself?
Yes, immensely.
In what way?
I spent a lot of time on my own praying and meditating, and it did give me the opportunity to do that quite extensively, and that changes you. I learnt just how stressful it is for somebody like Robert to do what he was doing, and the amount of stuff that he had to get done in the evening. I meant that if I happened to be talking to him when it was late at night for him, then I needed to allow for the fact that he didn't have much capacity left for having lengthy discussions, shall we say, and I learnt to cope with that. And when I did meet up with him, he always had a tremendous amount to do. He was always having to think about the next part of the route. So if he didn't learn patience, I learnt a little bit. Well, I think he did learn some patience. I value him much more.
Well, here I think is a $65,000 question. You've done this great thing, 18,000 miles all around the world. You're sort of setting some records. This has got to change your life in some way. I mean, you can't just do that and things go on just the same. Where do you go from here?
I'd like to know the answer to that question. Since I've got back, I've been catching up with friends and family. We've had Christmas. I got involved in the UK election that we had last year. Probably enough said about that. And then unfortunately I was ill with a flu type bug after Christmas for 6 weeks or so. There's a lot of time and effort gone into creating this film. I'm carrying out a number of talks and presentations to groups that are interested in the ride, be they adults, professional, schools, scouts and so on. So all of that's been taking up a lot of time. And yeah, I'm trying to discern what comes next, but waiting to discover exactly what that is.
Are there any challenges, any big challenges? I mean, to go around the world is probably the biggest challenge of all, but is there in the back of your mind somewhere just something you think, there's a germ of an idea forming there?
If I'd been a bit younger, I might have been thinking of trying to go up Mount Everest, but that's a tourist trail now, and you just join a queue to do. So that's not on the cards. But no, nothing concrete, not even a germ of an idea yet. But we'll have to wait and see.
The final few miles. A small group of family and friends set off from Woollerton Hall, a beautiful local Elizabethan palace. We stopped briefly at the Nottingham Industrial Museum to inspect their collection of old bikes. Then on to Bramcote Hills Park, to the finish line, picking up two of my grandchildren, Lucy and Maggie, on the way. We were joined for the final mile in the park by more cyclists before the welcome from Tony, Bishop of Sherwood, Robin, Chief Executive of Tradecraft, Mike, Mayor of Broxtowe, and Colin, local sports reporter. And then on for refreshments to St Michael's, Bramcote Church Centre. It was wonderful to see so many family and friends from all walks of my life. Work, church, sporting and university. It did seem incredible that it was 18 months previously that I had left from the same location at the start of the great adventure. It seemed like yesterday. A staggering £27,000 has been raised for the three charities
Tradecraft Exchange, Cancer Research UK and Bread, as a result of very generous donations from all over the world. The trip was completely self-funded, so all donations have gone directly to the charities. Truly life-changing for many people around the world.
Is coming up, but first, a Nottinghamshire man's completed an 18,000-mile charity cycle ride around the world. 64-year-old Robert Cleves covered 5 continents and raised £23,000 in the process. He actually arrived home several weeks ago, but was determined to finish the final leg of the journey today as planned.
I'd encourage you to follow your dreams. I didn't want to grow old regretting that I'd not had the courage to try it. When I set out, I didn't know whether I would get all the way round. At times it was very tough, but that's all part of the challenge and enjoyment.
But failure to me was not setting out and then finding out I couldn't carry on after a couple of months. Failure to me was not setting out in the first place. I think in many ways we've become too risk averse. We see reasons why we can't do something rather than work at managing the risks, eliminating and reducing them.
Job done. That's it. The end of a fantastic adventure.